During these lectures, I've emphasized several times that I think it's important for students to include in their information ecosystem sources that have alternative slants that represent different world views or different perspectives on a particular topic. And you might think to yourself, well, why is that so important? We talked a little bit about filter bubbles, but I also want to emphasize three tendencies of human thought that serve to further exacerbate the sorts of problems that we saw pointed to by Parser with filter bubbles, and just in general, the inability of people to go beyond, as Russell points out, their sort of very narrow time and place. The first tendency of thought is what's referred to in the psychological literature generally as confirmation bias. Now, the word bias may make it sound like it's a bad thing, like it's a prejudice, for instance. But that's not really the intent here. The idea behind confirmation bias is that our default way of seeking information, of thinking about whether or not something is true or false, is to look for evidence that confirms it, reasons that support it. Now, there are other strategies that we might employ. We might disconfirm. We might look for reasons why it's not the case that this is so. But overwhelmingly, humans tend to look for reasons to support something, reasons to believe that it's true, reasons that support an idea that they already have or a hypothesis that they're forwarding. And they tend not to engage in disconfirming strategies, which can also be quite useful. Now, confirmation bias can be troubling because once you have beliefs, once you have a hypothesis, if you just start looking for information that supports that hypothesis, or you start interpreting information in a way that tends to support the hypothesis and not considering alternative interpretations, then those mechanisms, those natural tendencies of human thought will introduce this disposition to only look for confirming evidence, to only accept confirming evidence, and to, in this way, further and further entrench yourself in a particular belief. In its most sort of rabid form, confirmation bias is a sort of deliberate intent to find evidence that supports a view and to ignore evidence that doesn't. But it needn't be that blatant to have these negative effects. Now, the next tendency of thought that I want to look at is called belief perseverance in the literature. And the belief perseverance literature talks about how it is that once people form a belief or formulate an estimate of a likelihood or something, or have a confidence about their belief, that they tend to perseverate in that and to discount evidence that comes by or comes later after they form that belief. And there are a lot of interesting experimental paradigms to demonstrate this. The one I find most interesting is called the debriefing paradigm. And the idea behind the debriefing paradigm is experimenters will create a situation that causes someone to form a belief based on false evidence, bad reasons. Then they will debrief them, inform them that that evidence was in fact bad, that they have no reason to believe something, and then look and see whether or not they continue, whether they perseverate in that belief, even in light of the fact that the reasons that they had have now been taken away. And what you find is that people do. They do it oftentimes quite significantly. So here's an example from that literature. So they get a bunch of students and they tell them they're going to train them to work on the suicide hotline. And the way they're going to train them is have them read suicide notes and then judge whether or not the person went on to commit suicide or not. Now, this would be a difficult task, and a lot of people don't express a lot of confidence in whether they can do it one way or another. But what they did in the experiment was they broke these people into groups that would get positive feedback, or groups that would get negative feedback, groups that would get ambiguous feedback. And so they'd have them read these notes. They would give their answer. the subjects, and then they would get positive feedback, negative feedback, or ambiguous feedback. Now, the people, not surprisingly, who got a disproportionate amount of positive feedback, oh, you really did good, oh, you're so intuitive, and so on, they tended to come to form the belief that they were good at this task. People who got negative feedback, they tended to form the belief they were bad at this task. And people who got ambiguous feedback, they tended to form the belief that, I'm not that good or bad, it's hard to say. But importantly, they then debriefed them. And they said, look, none of these were actual suicide deaths. We just, got a bunch of country music CDs or, turned the country music channel on Apple Radio, a bottle of Jack Daniels, and just typed them all out ourselves. Mm-hmm. So none of these were true. In fact, the point of this experiment was to give you this false feedback. And then they would ask these people, how do you think you would do on this task were you to do it in real life? And the people who had formed the belief that they were good at it, they said, I think I'll be pretty good. And the people who had formed the belief they were bad at it, I think I'll be terrible. Right? And what is interesting about that is then when pushed on this one said, look, you don't have any real reason for that. Not all the evidence that we've given you in this experiment, that's no good evidence at all. They would engage in confirmation bias. They would go back and they would say to themselves, sure, that was all bogus in the experiment, but I remember when old Uncle Joe was depressed, I was the one that noticed that. I really am intuitive. And so they would go back and try and find evidence to support that belief, even though the cause of that belief had been false evidence, bad reasons, and they really didn't have much of a stake in maintaining the belief or not. And so we can see this interaction between confirmation bias and belief perseverance that represents a fundamentally vicious circle that would push us farther and farther and farther into our own idiosyncratic and dogmatic worldviews. This can be even more exacerbated by what is referred to sometimes in the literature as the backfire effect. And the backfire effect is sort of like belief perseverance, but on steroids. Essentially, when people get confronted about beliefs that are emotionally important or that are central to the conception of themselves, they're integral to their worldview, things of this nature, when they're given reasons to suppose those views aren't true, then they oftentimes will report believing them at an even higher confidence level after the evidence than before. So attempts to debunk a view actually backfire. And you, in fact, have these people retrenching, doubling down on that belief, claiming they believe it even more now. And so when you think about these mechanisms, these natural tendencies of human thought operating in your everyday life, you may say, maybe other people do that. Everyone does these things. And so the reason why I emphasize exposing yourself to alternative perspectives is that at least when you can confront individuals who may provide you with evidence or reasons for why it is that your belief isn't true, you at least have a chance to disengage from that belief perseverance or that confirmation bias, to hold on to that value of believing things that are true and that are based on good evidence, and maybe tempering your views. Additionally, by being exposed to people with alternative perspectives, it helps to facilitate an understanding of why intelligent and informed people may differ from you on things like policy issues or laws and things of that nature. And it helps to facilitate respectful and productive interaction between individuals who disagree. And so I really do think it's important. Just exposing yourself to that information, as the backfire effect shows, belief perseverance shows, may not be sufficient. But if you conscientiously try to hold true to your value of the truth, if you try to be open-minded about even things that are close to your heart or integral to your worldview, then being exposed to alternatives may in fact be productive. It may help you to understand other people, may help you to see, hey, maybe I shouldn't believe that, or maybe the reasons I have aren't as strong as I thought they were.